Question mark here. This is my OLTD 506 reflection 1.4 and a lot of topics tonight. Voice from a digitally divided field, social justice boundaries, and Aboriginal context. So there's a lot to talk about here, but I'll try to put it in concisely as possible. So my initial thought when I was looking at the idea of the digital divide and starting with the Wikipedia article was that for me the largest digital divide is the divide, maybe an age divide. So in my experience, it's a divide between students who are quite digitally capable in some ways, maybe not in educational specific areas, but certainly in terms of being familiar and comfortable with technology. And a lot of the staff that I've had the experience of working with, wonderful teachers, but not necessarily confident with technology. So I see that divide, and it wasn't directly talked about in the articles, but I see that as a major problem, and it will kind of come up a little bit later. Looking at the definition of digital divide, it, if we look at Canada, United States, we see different, sort of that 20% of Canadians on average don't have access. But as I read on, the idea of digital divide goes further than just access, and it's not just defined by restrictions to access, but more through the divide of students who have been trained and taught using the 21st century technology and skills. So the students who don't have access to digital technology are not being trained in those skills, and the problem just worsens. I guess on a positive note, the statistics show that BC at 84% is one of the highest, or has one of the lowest digital divides, I suppose, in terms of access. One of the things I was thinking about is a lot of the literature sort of, I don't know if it just hinted at or it suggested that, if we can't provide equality of access to our students, then maybe we shouldn't. And it kind of made me think of the question, well, should we not? I mean, should we use that as an excuse? Because I hear that in school sometimes. Well, not all students have internet at home, so I don't use internet in the classroom. And it made me stop for a second and wonder, well, what's worse, not using internet technology, even if we recognize a divide, or doing our very best to narrow that divide, but still not using it as an excuse. And as I talked about a little bit earlier, that idea of perhaps teachers are part of that divide, just being raised in a digital immigrants, I think I've heard the term used, we weren't citizens as a lot of the younger generations are. So looking at the Goodman article, The Digital Divide is Still Leaving Americans Behind, was really interesting. It suggested that perhaps the students' use of smartphones might help narrow the digital divide, and there had pros and cons for that. And it brought me to an example last year. I had one student. I remember one day I was acting principal, and a teacher brought the student's cell phone to me and asked that I call the parent to come pick it up because she was using her cell phone in class. And ironically, the next semester I had that student in my class, and she was doing a website project, and she ended up kind of being a superstar for me because she was using all of her phone to produce amazing work on her Weebly site, and she could actually produce work faster on her phone than she could using a computer. Now that's not the case for me. I can't stand typing on a smartphone, but I think it just sort of reminded me of the fact that perhaps the smartphones aren't the answers, but maybe they're answers for some of our students, and certainly in the case of this one student for me, using a smartphone, and she had an unlimited data plan, and mom was happy accommodating that, was certainly a way to reach that student and make her a leader in our classroom. So that was kind of a neat story. Going on to the Warschauer and Matushniak article, the pronunciation right there. I spent a lot of time with this article reading it. Obviously the focus on access, use, and outcomes. Some of the things that came up were sort of the inequalities of, I suppose, of lower socioeconomic schools and the Latino population. And I remember looking at the map of Canada. I noticed that Quebec was tied for the second lowest in Canada, and I wondered if maybe there was a correlation between language and the English language, which comes up later in the Aboriginal argument. I'm trying to think of the name of that article. Was the Fritz Panacook article on cyber imperialism and sort of the dominance of the English language. And anyway, sort of back to Warschauer and get this right, Matuchniak. The idea that lower socioeconomic schools definitely had barriers, sort of built-in barriers that made it more difficult to adapt technology and further the digital divide. There's one quote I specifically earmarked. Teachers in low socioeconomic schools tended to be less experienced, and technical support infrastructures were not always as good. Parents were less able to guide their children on effective use of technology. Many low socioeconomic schools were in high crime neighborhoods, and there was thus more concern about laptops being stolen when taken home. And teachers had difficulty figuring out the best way to integrate laptops in situations where there were larger numbers of English language learners and students at below basic reading levels. And I thought that kind of summed up everything, and it's, I think back to my sociology days in university and political science and those ideas of cycles of poverty. They're certainly are demonstrated in this context. And then finally, the idea of boys and girls, and perhaps boys have an advantage because of they spend more time on technology than girls, at least playing video games. So then, looking finally at Aboriginal context, it was kind of a really negative and really positive. Reading the Fritz Panacook article and talking about the cyber imperialism and the marginalization of Canada's Indigenous people. A couple quotes that I pulled from that. It can be argued that a knowledge economy based largely on Canadian Aboriginal culture and multicultural traditions practices is not possible because the global nature of the internet is such that it precludes this as an option. Obviously, very negative and not to be ignored. Again, another quotation from that article. However, what does emerge is that as the first world becomes increasingly connected, those who do not have access to its cyber resources will be increasingly marginalized and become victims of yet another revolution. And again, I think this is the theme of the entire digital divide, and it's well said by Fritz Panacook. On the positive side, you could not ignore the idea that, and I think put forward by Taylor, data from different regions of Canada and anecdotal reports suggest that First Nations and Inuit people have embraced social media using tools such as Facebook, YouTube, Twitter to keep in touch with home communities, fight addiction, showcase Aboriginal arts and crafts, preserve community identity, support political advocacy. Though there are well-founded misgivings among Aboriginal peoples regarding the potential negative impact of social media on their cultures and languages, it is clear that many are using these technologies in the fight to preserve Aboriginal cultures and identity. And there's the positive side and the hope with social media. So I don't know where it goes. I think the idea that Panacook used the word revolution is true. It is a revolution, and it's here, and we have to deal with it, and we shouldn't be scared of it, and it needs to be supported and pushed. And I think I'd like to think those steps are happening, and especially in BC, and I'm happy to be a part of that. So a little bit longer tonight, but I think there was a lot more to talk about. So there you go. Thanks, Justin Mark, signing off.